Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
Hello and welcome to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of June 1st. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm joined today by Josh Blank, Research Director of the Texas Politics Project. How are we today, Josh?
Well, okay, I guess. You know, it's a lot going on out there. I'm not sure how I'm doing.
In the context, that's a trickier question than normal, I guess, although I don't know what normal is at this point, actually.
I think that summarizes it.
So the major political story everywhere this week, of course, is the wave of protests and civil unrest across the country following the killing of George Floyd by a police officer in Minneapolis on Memorial Day. This has included marches and sporadic clashes between protesters and police all over the country. Some of these clashes more than sporadic, actually, I suppose. And this is included in several Texas cities over the last few days, although by and large, the clashes in Texas have not been among the worst, although there are probably a lot of things going on we don't know about, and it'll take a few days of debriefing. Dallas, I think, has been probably the worst, or the site of the most protest and the most problems in Texas, is at least per what we know so far. So we're going to talk about this some today. This is a hugely complicated topic, so we'll obviously just be hitting aspects of this in a 20, 30-minute session. That's all we can do. But chances are, the nature of the thing is such, chances are very good that we'll be coming back to this subject sooner rather than later, given the way things look. So as we record this late Tuesday morning, the president substantively addressed the situation for the first time on Monday night. He declared himself, quote unquote, "You're president of law and order." Actually, I guess he said, "You're president of the law and order," in a kind of Trumpian locution. And also urged governors to deploy the National Guard to, quote unquote, dominate the streets. He promised that if the governors didn't do that, he would deploy the U.S. military to the states. We should note that technically the governors have to request such a deployment under existing law. So how does this play in Texas? Well, Governor Abbott has deployed the DPS and National Guard to cities around the state to support local police. There were arrests in Dallas just last night after a protest that was initially being allowed at City Hall took a bad turn that's still being investigated. And I don't want to say too much about that because we don't know too much about that yet. The setup was that there had been a curfew in Dallas. There was going to be a protest at City Hall that was outside of the curfew area that authorities were aware of and had seemingly signed off on. And then there wound up being arrests and incidents there. And that's going to be sorted out. And the governor's going to Dallas today. As of now, there will be curfews going through the next few nights for sure in Dallas and in Fort Worth. I believe the curfew in Dallas, as of now, absent further action by the city council, is good for 7 days under the original order. And how has Greg Abbott played this? I'd say he's played it characteristically. Does that seem fair to you, Josh?
Yeah, I would say that seems very fair.
You know, I mean, I think he's been speaking to his constituency, and I mean, I don't think anybody would confuse Abbott for a Democratic governor in the way that he's responded, probably. But he's also attempted to project a kind of judiciousness that stands in contrast with Trump, I think. So we had some excerpts from what Trump said. The governor said, quote unquote, "It's necessary that all states use all law enforcement tools to make sure that more innocent people are not either killed or maimed or injured." And that was his response to what he thought the president was saying. And that even in itself is a much more measured characterization of than the tone taken by the president, right?
Right. Well, I mean, ultimately he's constrained by a set of attitudes here that are, pre-existing to, I mean, this is sort of what you were kind of highlighting at the beginning in some ways, which is to say, the things we're going to talk about feel very pressing in the present moment. But to the extent that political actors and protests, I mean, when I say political actors, I mean across the board political actors, whether you're talking about governors, presidents, or protesters are responding to in most cases, are really long-standing and long-term attitudes, opinions, considerations, grievances, right? And so I think one of the things that you're sort of that I think Abbott was leaning on in this case, something that constrains him, and we'll get into some of the specific attitudes in Texas, that may or may not be, that are partially relevant to parts of this, because again, there's a lot. Ultimately here you've got a couple of things going on. Historically, Republicans have tended to paint themselves as the party of quote unquote law and order. That is a term with a long and complicated history that also has, that does coincide with, again, sort of racial animus and other things. But it's also something that Republicans have used as a way to sort of contrast themselves with Democrats who are seen as being historically, quote unquote, sort of soft on crime. And so to one extent, I mean, Abbott in that quote is basically saying, look, of course we're going to use all of the law enforcement tools available to us to protect people because that's what we do. That's what governors do, Republican or Democratic. But it's also something that speaks to, I think, his voters. But the other piece of this too is, I think for Abbott in some ways is, the idea of even a Republican president mobilizing the U.S. Army to go into states to provide, a police force is not something that necessarily, I would say, coincides with Republican views of federalism and the role of the federal government, right? I mean, we've even had experiences like this recently that Abbott's pushed back on, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that, I was having this conversation, interestingly enough, with somebody else recently, and I think, some of the polling that we've done in the past on how people understand these levels of government and how consistent their views are suggests that there's not an enormous amount of consistency there necessarily. But I think you do have to notice that, after, the Republican governors are no strangers to telling the federal government to manage their boundaries and butt out of what the states are doing. Mm-hmm. And Trump is clearly kind of reformulating that in his position on all this. Although it wasn't that long ago when, in response to the pandemic, and by the way, the pandemic is still going on.
Right. Wear your masks.
The president was leaving it up to the governor to do, or was leaving it up to the governors in the states to take prime responsibility and to take the blame when he felt like it. So, I think as we look at, Abbott's response to this, we can contrast it with Trump in certain kinds of ways. It may be, part of it is substantive, part of it is tonal. I think the president has been roundly criticized for really saying very little beyond a pro forma acknowledgement that, Floyd had been killed by the police. Abbott has been a little more forthcoming on that in the same, reaction to the president yesterday. The governor, referred to Floyd's death as quote unquote a horrific act of police brutality, unquote, which is definitely much further than the president has gone. But then pivoted in a way, as you kind of imply there, to the subject of criminal justice reform, but also the protection of communities from looting and property destruction, quote unquote. And so you can see the governor trying to negotiate between these poles and these attitudes. And these different attitudes that you're referring to. And it's a political challenging situation, I think for any political leader that is trying to take a nuanced view of this. And, just say, that is not really what we're seeing from the president. I don't think you have to be a partisan to acknowledge that. I think the president would almost certainly acknowledge that in some ways. But it's challenging because there are real radical differences in perceptions among different groups. And so let's take a look at that and drill down into the polling we've got a little bit. Let's start with views of the police. So in the 2019 UT Texas Tribune poll, we asked about views of the police. So why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and so this was in a battery of institutions. So we asked about the police, the military, federal government, state government, local government. In different polls, we might have asked about the public schools or the churches, things like that. And in this poll, what we found was that 58% of Texas voters said that they held a favorable view of the police, with 23% saying that they held an unfavorable view. This was the highest favorability rating given to any institution tested in that poll, save for the military, at 71%. So it's higher than the federal government, higher than the state government, higher than local governments, courts, and the criminal justice system as well. But, as you might not be surprised to learn, there were significant differences by race. 67% of white voters said that they hold a favorable view of the police, compared to 52% of Hispanics and only 31% of African Americans. Only 9% of African Americans said that they hold a very favorable view of the police, compared to 24% of Hispanics and 36% of whites. So 4 times the share of whites than black people say they hold a very favorable view of the police in Texas. Getting into the politics of this, partisanship, as in so many other things, also matters here. So 78% of Republicans hold a favorable view of the police, 48% hold a very favorable view, but the same can only be said of 39% of Democrats, and only 11% of Democrats hold a very favorable view of the police. So, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I think what's interesting about this, or one thing to pause on that about, is that, in some ways, this confirms the preconceptions of people on polarized sides of both of views of the police. So if you are somebody that, is arguing that, from a conservative or very pro-police perspective, that, people don't respect them or don't have regard for them or don't trust them, there's empirical confirmation of the fact that that's the case, right? From the other, and then from a more, critical side, from a side that's more critical of the police, or trying to point out just how different views are and how different these experiences are for different social groups, one can say, well, sure, look, of course, people respond differently to the police. They have different views, but what the other polling that we've seen shows that view is rooted in experience, right?
That's right. So in a survey that I conducted for the Texas Lyceum in 2016 among Texas adults, we asked whether or not people could recall a specific experience in which they had felt that they were discriminated against by the police based on their race or ethnicity. And what we found in that poll was, and again, this is Texas adults, so it's actually a broader group, more representative of the entire state. What we found was 1 in 20 white Texans say that they have felt discriminated against by the police. 1 in 4 Hispanic Texans feels that they've been discriminated against by the police. And 1 in 2 African Americans in Texas say they can remember a specific instance in which they felt discriminated against by the police. And so ultimately, you're right. I mean, what we're talking about here is a totally different experience. And it's something as someone who studies, behavior and attitudes and people and stuff, it's something that I think, we all kind of lose sight of oftentimes, is the extent to which, our social networks are extremely homogenous, which means they're usually very similar. So ultimately, most people spend time with people who are like them. And that includes, sort of their socioeconomic background or the socioeconomic backgrounds of their families, their education levels, their political views. And so really, this idea, I think this is one of the most, I would actually say in all of the survey work I've done over the last decade in Texas, this is the one that sticks out to me because you so rarely see such amazing experiential differences here. But the idea here for, especially a lot of, white people, and in particular, a lot of white Republicans, they're not having the same experience with police that black people are. Now, I know that's kind of obvious, but the data paints this very, very clearly, in a way that's important. I think going back to the last, just to the result before that about sort of, the favorite, sort of positive affect or, less positive affect towards the police, ultimately, police reform is police or criminal justice reform is one route to potentially address some of these grievances. But as you again said at the top, these grievances are much bigger than that. have a much longer life in history and are actually much more pervasive than simply police practices, is I think what a lot of, people sort of pushing for social justice reform would say generally. But the idea here is that when you then go and begin with police reform and start sort of talking about, well, what can we do differently with police officers? What people have to realize is that there's a large share of the population for whom the idea that the police are, by and large, doing a great job, but for a few bad apples, that's a very strong argument because it lands with how they feel about police. And ultimately, we all want to confirm our beliefs. And so that just makes that a very difficult path, I think, politically for, anyone, let alone a Republican governor in a nominally Republican state, to pursue with too much vigor, given, again, the way that their voters feel.
Yeah, and I think that, in terms of how this evidence weighs into that discussion, I think a lot of the rhetoric winds up settling on groups accusing the other of having beliefs that are about, something abstract, and it's about you don't have regard for me
Right.
or my group, or, in the case of the police, my profession. And it's seen as these kind of free-floating attitudes and ideas that people have that are either right or wrong. And, I think you're right to be, proud of that polling result, because it really underlines something that keeps coming out in these discussions, but they tend to come out only under times of crisis, which is, which is Black people saying, I have a very different experience on a day-to-day level in my contact with the police and in the larger world with discrimination than you do, when they're talking
Right.
to non-white to non-Black audiences. And that experience is a different level of discussion that, because of some of the sociological dynamics you're talking about, in group and social sorting, if you will, that I think people don't enter into the discussion very frequently, in part because they don't have the opportunity to, and in part because, as you suggest, it's in conflict with their predispositions, and it's not confirmatory of what is more comfortable and more, cognitively deeply rooted for them.
Well, and I think you hit the nail on the head there, right? Which is obviously, I have to do that sometimes. It's in my contract. But obviously, you're highlighting the fact that people have, because of their group memberships, they just have different experiences of these things. And even this idea about, who faces discrimination is something that there's actually a lot of disagreement on in our polling. And so we've done a bunch of polling on attitudes toward discrimination in society, and we've gotten, some reactions that are kind of expected and some maybe that are a little bit less expected. So, on the one hand, there is an overall perception that there is, racial and ethnic discrimination in society. That's not something that, people are blind to or don't understand exists. But one of the things that we wanted to do, and we've done this a couple times in our polling, is we basically want to get, basically Texans' perceptions on the relative discrimination that different groups in society face. So what we do is we ask about how much discrimination a list of groups in society that have, in some cases tend to be marginalized or are claimed to be facing a lot of discrimination by political leaders, how much discrimination those groups are facing in society today, according to Texas voters. So are they facing a lot of discrimination, some discrimination, not very much or not at all? And then once we go through all the groups, then we ask, well, which of these groups faces the most? And the idea is this is a considered opinion now. You've rated the amount of discrimination that everybody has faced, and then you say, well, who faces the most? So the last time we did this was in June of 2018, and we found that 68% of Texans that African Americans face a lot or some discrimination. 67% said that Hispanics face a lot or some discrimination in America today, compared to 39% who said the same thing about white people. So we know that there's an understanding broadly that there are different experiences of discrimination. And when we asked which group faces the most discrimination, and we included those groups mentioned Asians, women, men, gays and lesbians, transgender people, Christians and Muslims, along with whites, African Americans, and Hispanics, the plurality of Texans, 21%, said that African Americans face the most discrimination. On the other hand, perceptions of discrimination against one's own group are actually the most apparent. So when we look at just the responses of African Americans, 59% say that they face the most discrimination in America today, followed by the LGBTQ community, combining some of those responses at 21%.
That's within the perceptions of African Americans.
Right. So that's among African Americans, 59%
Right.
say that African Americans face the most discrimination. Among Hispanics, 26% say that they face the most discrimination. That's the plurality. So that's the biggest share of any
themselves,
group.
yeah.
Right. Muslims were second among Hispanics and then African Americans. Among white Texans, 22% said that Christians face the most discrimination in America today. That was followed by Muslims at 21%, then transgender people at 14%, then white people at 14%, and then African Americans at 12%.
Okay, so let's stop there and just underline that there's any number of things we could probably talk for another half hour about that result itself. But there's a couple of really interesting things going on there, right? One, the displacement of race by religion among white folks, right? Mm-hmm. In that, race sort of moves out of the number one position, race or ethnicity, that it occupies among minority groups and is replaced by A, religion, and B, the religion that is most frequently embraced, broadly speaking, by white people.
Right. And so, the other constraint we've been talking about here is the partisan constraints that are going on. And so, we could talk specifically about the overlap between race and ethnicity and party, but for the purposes of sort of understanding government action or inaction or what kinds of actions we will or will not see, this is kind of important. So a plurality of Democrats, 35%, say that African Americans face the most discrimination in America today. Among Republicans, 31% said that Christians face the most discrimination, followed by whites. Among Republicans, said 17% of Republicans said that whites face the most discrimination. 14% said that Muslims face the most discrimination. 10% said that transgender people face the most discrimination. And then 7% said that African Americans face the most discrimination. So ultimately, these two efforts, there's some summary points to this I think, I want Jim to hit on, but something strikes me in this that's kind of, important in sort of thinking about these attitudes is that, ultimately, if you're thinking about these protests should, produce some kind of change, right? And we've talked about this before, Jim, but, you may agree or disagree, but it seems to me there's sort of two broad paths one could think of. There's a sort of a narrow path that says, well, let's focus specifically on police actions and criminal justice reform more broadly, but this is about reforming the way that police do their policing, right? Another side of the argument would say, no, this is about systemic racism. This is about longstanding and inequities, sometimes, government-sponsored discrimination in all kinds of government programs, housing, other things worth looking into, right? That basically have discriminated against African Americans, for centuries, right? That's a pretty big policy area, right? And ultimately, one would, the police reform would be, let's focus on police practices. Sort of systemic racism is actually much bigger and would require wholesale shifts in, all kinds of policy and redistributive policies. Ultimately, what these two results show us is that, one, on the former, there's not a lot of appetite amongst white people and amongst Republicans in Texas to criticize police or to criticize police practices. On the other side, on the argument about sort of, systemic racism, there's not really a large share of belief amongst whites in general, but Republicans in particular in Texas, that African Americans are discriminated against very much. In particular,
at a real basic level, if you say to a large group of people, and frankly, within the terms of the Texas political system at this moment, mm-hmm. Let's talk about discrimination. What this suggests is that the majority party, a third of them, the first thing they're going to be triggered on that is not discrimination against African Americans, it's discrimination against Christians.
Exactly. And actually, we've seen a lot more action in the last couple of legislative sessions trying to protect the rights of Christians from discrimination than we have for African Americans, just in all reality.
Right. So I think that, if we go back to where we started in a way, this helps us fill in, why we're, what the political roots are, if you will, of the different responses that we're seeing and from different very high profile political leaders and how they are framing this. These things, if you just sort of step back and think about the public as receiving messages, if you will, in a given moment from political leaders, when those messages go out, they are landing very differently among different people. When Donald Trump makes a speech from the Rose Garden talking about supporting the police, restoring law and order, and doesn't really mention in any sustained way the grievances of the protesters, peaceful or not, or the incident that triggered this and kind of re-raised all these issues in such a dramatic way. People that do not see discrimination against blacks as a fundamental problem or as a widespread problem are going to receive that much more positively than people that do not. I mean, this is sort of being overly simplistic, but I mean, just to break it all down, what public opinion is telling you here is what the field of reception is like and how it's going to vary.
Well, at the very least, I mean, amongst the president's base of supporters, it's not going to feel as though something was missing. Right. I mean, the thing that you're saying was not said, the idea of, any sort of discussion about what the grievances are or what kind of reforms, the government might spearhead or even potentially talk about is not there because ultimately, it's not something that, his base is ready to hear. Now, look, ultimately, what you could argue is that's what leadership is. Leadership would bring people along and sort of say, well, no, but, this is actually important. But the point here is, to the extent that his communications have been criticized by some for not including these messages or not, reaching out to sort of heal these wounds. The reality is that, as you pointed out, that message is going to land perfectly fine amongst a large share of the Republican base, at least in Texas.
Yeah, and certainly that's what our data tell us. And I think that, I would be surprised if the president is not getting, advice, from looking out at the national perspective that's telling him the same thing. And I think that's one of the reasons that they are approaching this the way they are. However much they're being criticized by those who are not part of their coalition. And I think even from there's plenty of ground from both a practical and an ethical perspective to criticize this approach. But the president is ever mindful of his 2020 election effort, and he and his supporters and his advisors have a theory of that election, I think. And I think that theory is that they need to maintain their base and build outward from that. And the core of his base is mostly white, mostly conservative, mostly older. And this is accentuated by the president's personal political style, which is one that, opts whenever possible for aggression and for activating the negative emotions of his base. That's from the campaign to the president's inauguration speech, the now famous kind of American Carnage speech, which was really about anger and fear and disappointment and a promise to overcome that. I think that promise has really been more kept in terms of continuing to reference those fears and anxieties than actually, remedying that situation. Back in Texas, it looks very different. Greg Abbott's not on the ballot in 2020. He's in a state in which the dominant kind of partisan political narrative of the last 2 years, more or less, has been that the state is becoming more competitive among Republicans and Democrats, and that the conventional Republican strategy of appealing only to the base that has worked here for a couple of decades may not work as well in the future, particularly if you're a legislator or a member of Congress. Greg Abbott's not on the ballot, but he wants to, he is mindful of being the leader of his party. And he's also in a situation where the protests have not quite been quite so visceral and had quite the impact in the state, and he's taking a different approach. And I think it's a matter of degree, not kind, but it is different.
Yeah, I think that's right. Ultimately, you're right. I think Abbott not being on the ballot makes a big difference, but also, the thing that sort of, I think people know, they know this, but they don't really incorporate it into their views of Texas is the reality that, Texas is an extremely diverse state, right? This is not the stereotype of Texas, and Greg Abbott is not, is maybe more a stereotypical Texan in some way than actually matches Texas, right? This is the problem with stereotypes sometimes. They don't actually match the reality. Texas is a majority minority state. And
it's an urban state.
And it's an urban state. That's right. It's an urban majority minority state in which, about 60% of Texas adults over the age of 40 are white, and about 60% of adults under the age of 40 are not white. And as you get younger, you're getting more and more diverse. You're closer to about 70% of Texas population is non-white if you look at under 18-year-olds. And so, ultimately, these grievances are going to have to be addressed some way, somehow. When I say these grievances, I'm kind of taking the catch-all. I don't even mean just these specific grievances. I mean sort of the bucket of grievances that this is actually probably bringing together here, which goes beyond simply the killing of George Floyd, or even more localized police killings or police practices in general, to the disparate impacts of the coronavirus pandemic, among communities of color, the disparate impact of job losses, because of the economic downturn in communities of color, the slower recovery from economic crises that are experienced by communities of color, and on top of all of that, the fact that especially for younger people in Texas, who again are by and large non-white, this is actually an economic crisis on the heels of the 2008 economic crisis, of which the younger generation in Texas and elsewhere has never recovered. There's a lot going on here, and as we said, we can only talk about a little bit of this.
Yeah, what you're saying, I think, and I think this is right, is that these moments of when the vast differences in the across-the-board experiences of Americans of different races surface in moments of crisis like this, and they're brought to the fore, and the frustration with the pace of progress, and just as we've talked about lived experience a lot in this, and just the experience of that, they erupt almost uncontrollably, and they fall outside the lines of day-to-day institutional politics. And I think that there is something about this moment, the confluence of it, that does seem, I don't know what the word is. You were kind of getting at this, this sense that there's something that is out there now that, given not just the very deeply seated problem of racism as a systemic feature of American politics, and racism and its various nuances, but also the fact of that this is now intertwined with the economic difficulties that are accompanying the present moment. And, who would have thought we'd be doing a podcast and not really discuss the pandemic at all? But as you say, that pandemic is also brought out these racial disparities, and it's, there's a critical mass here that I think is one of the things that is sustaining the protests. And typically I think our expectation is, based on history, these things happen. They go, you have civil unrest, you have protest, it goes on, and it kind of just dissipates after a few days. This has been going on for a week. And I also think that, there's no normal to go back to because of a number of reasons: the economic dislocation, the pandemic, and frankly the tone and the approach of the Trump presidency, which does not seem aimed thus far at trying to defuse it, but is actually stoking it.
Well, that's right. And I think that's also the thing that makes this feel, so different, is the fact that there is, I mean, not to be like a total Debbie Downer here, although I don't see any problem with it in the current moment. There is no release valve for these tensions. There's no, we said, people were kind of saying over the weekend, when is the president going to come out and make, a speech?
Well, there's no institutional release valve, right?
There's no institutional release, but but ultimately this is about
I think we're seeing
institutions.
what release valve has been left.
I mean, look, but ultimately we're talking about institutions. I mean, you can go and find lists of every business that has and has not made a statement on racial equality this morning very easily. What you can't find is federal or state governments with any particular response to this. Now, again, it's a lot harder, but ultimately it's hard to even imagine what that release valve looks like, right? Where, you imagine an institutional response that allows protesters, people who agree or disagree, with the protests and the protesters themselves to be able to say, okay, we're going to do this thing now. We're going to have, some sort of process, or we feel like we've been heard and something's going to happen. It may take a while. It's hard to imagine what that's going to look like in the near term. And part of that is both, these underlying political attitudes we're talking about, the difficulty of the issue, but the fact that we're also facing now 3 major crises at once. And there's only so much resources to go around. I don't mean money. I just mean attention. I mean political capital. I mean willpower to deal with these things. And I think if history is any guide, I was going to say, I think if history is any guide, focusing on the grievances of non-white people is probably not going to be the top of the list.
Certainly of
addressing
the governing
crises
coalition
right now.
in Washington D.C. right now, and elsewhere. So what the response that makes people feel heard and is a credible response, I think, has remained elusive. So I think on that note, we've flagged the economy. We'll probably come back and talk about that. Texas, in a thing that sounds very mundane compared to the both difficult and deep structural problems we've been talking about. Tax revenues are very low in the state right now, and this is going to feed into these other problems. That news came out this week, and also the pandemic numbers in Texas right now are deeply ambiguous. Some elements of the political leadership are cherry picking some of those numbers and saying that things are getting better. And to be fair, others are accentuating the negative, but they're very ambiguous. The 7-day moving averages, depending on what you look at in terms of infection and positive tests, look at best flat.
But it's also, but again, the whole thing about the testing is, and I'll just throw this out there, is it's not a random sample of the state. And again, I'm a statistics nerd, all this kind of stuff, but these tests are not being just randomly distributed across the state to people and just to see whether they have it or not, to give us some sort of sense. I think we had the highest number of new infections on Sunday, maybe, because they went and they tested a prison that had a ton of infections. Right. And so ultimately, those data are very difficult to unpack for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, the tests are not random, and compared to other states, I think as of yesterday, Texas was 43rd among the 50 states in tests per million people. And all this data is a little bit touch and go. It's flowing in at different times, people. But Texas has never been, I don't think, for more than a day or so within the top 40 of the 50 states. So not only is the testing not random, there's not much of it going on. Mm-hmm. So on that, we will belatedly end this, and we will see you next week. Take care and stay well. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.